Welcome back to the You're Not Crazy podcast, where we bring survivor stories into the light, highlight various forms of abuse, and examine the intersections of faith, trauma, and healing. I'm Kendra, your host.
And I'm Kass, your co-host for this season. We're so glad to have you with us for episode 2. Today, we're continuing the story of Leigh, a wife, mother of 4, counselor, and leader in her faith community, as she shares her journey of resilience and survival.
In episode 1, we covered quite a bit, including Leigh's journey into her new faith, her move to the West Coast, and her whirlwind 4-month engagement to Jack. We then touched on the early days of their marriage, where Leigh began to see Jack's darker side for the first time.
We left off with Jack losing his job and Leigh feeling isolated, having lost her entire community.
This is unfortunately a common reality for people in abusive relationships. Moving from place to place, trying to rebuild after each fallout or crisis, it leaves survivors constantly starting over, and it takes an immense toll.
Absolutely. It's a heartbreaking cycle. As we dive into episode 2, we want to remind you that most guests use alternative names for privacy, and each survivor's story is unique. The views shared here are personal to each guest and don't necessarily reflect those of Kendra, myself, or the podcast.
Yes, and as always, we'll include content warnings for each episode. In episode 2, we'll be discussing rage episodes, gambling, alcoholism, spiritual manipulation, and emotional and financial abuse. So please listen with care. Now, let's listen as Leigh opens up about the first few months of her marriage to Jack.
First few months were rough, and then it just started to roll downhill after that. But being the good Pollyanna that I was like, we'll make the best of it. There was just a lot of instability on his part with being able to hold a job. And I had also lost my grandma that year too. So there was loss happening at home. I'm still pretty isolated. We're visiting different churches, never really finding a community again. And I'm pregnant. And I'm so happy to be pregnant, but feeling really alone in my pregnancy. I was really sick, just throwing up every day for the first 6 months it went. I remember telling my doctor, you said after the first 3 months this will get better, but I, for whatever reason, just had a really rough time. And I remember one time being in the bathroom, being so sick and just exhausted. Jack turning the television volume up, and I got so angry and said, at least you could hold my hair back or come check on me. There was no nurturing that ever happened.
What did he say?
Yeah, I was watching something, probably a game, and that was important to him. There was no making sense of it for him. There was never really an aha moment of, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Of course, are you okay? Or I just felt really alone inside the marriage.
Feeling little care or support from Jack and isolated from her family, Leigh drew on her own inner strength as she tried to embrace the joy of a first pregnancy. She often wondered, is this what all women go through? Each new experience in her marriage with Jack left her questioning what was normal. When the time came to give birth to her daughter, a time of fear and uncertainty for any new mother, Leigh longed for reassurance and someone to lean on. But once again, Jack remained distant, in his own world, seemingly unaware and unwilling to provide the comfort she so desperately needed.
We were on the way to the hospital, and I remember saying, can you slow down, take it a little easy over these bumps and things like that, because I'm about to burst, and in so much pain. And just the insensitivity on the ride there, and then had a really difficult time delivering my daughter, and it lasted for a long time. I'm feasting on ice chips, and he brings in food for himself from Taco Bell or whatever, and just eating in front of me, just really insensitive, disappearing because there again was a game on. So down in the lounge while I'm trying to sweat it out and work it out, on my own and, feeling really I just need to lean into the nurses and trust this process. But yeah, I didn't have any family there or anything, so it was just us, but he kept disappearing. And even when he was in the room, he wasn't.
So I just want to highlight another significant moment in your life that's tainted. Okay, you're having your first baby. This should be a moment of support and togetherness and celebration. And once again, he's there, but he's not doing anything to seem like he's engaged or caring or supportive. Because it's like you technically have a partner, you have a husband that's supposed to be providing these things. He's not outwardly saying, I don't want to give you this. But with the way he's showing up, he's saying, I'm not going to do this for you. That's really confusing. It's really painful. And of course, it's going to make anyone feel really alone. The feeling of isolation only deepened for Leigh. She and Jack began hopping from one church to another, hoping to find a community that would provide the support and connection she needed. Each visit left her feeling more disheartened, but she didn't give up. Eventually, they tried a Presbyterian church, and after some time, decided to have their daughter dedicated there. It was meant to be a joyous occasion, a celebration of life and faith, yet even this special moment, which should have been filled with love and warmth, was tainted by Jack.
After my daughter's dedication, the church was doing construction, so we were parked off-site, and so the bus from the church would take us from our cars back and forth. So we were parked at a strip mall, and back then everything is closed on a Sunday. And he got angry with me for some reason. I think it was because I needed to nurse her. So we were fighting because I wanted to go to a room or stay. He wanted to hit the bus, and I needed to nurse her. When you need to nurse, you need to nurse. And I'm not sure exactly what transpired, but what I do know is that he left me in the parking lot with my 3-month-old who needed to nurse, with nowhere to go, no cell phones, and no one, because we were in a new community. Again, I just ended up walking up and down and found somebody that was inside one of the stores and asked them to use the phone, and I had memorized his sister's phone number, and she came and got me.
Nothing seemed to be working anymore. Jack struggled with job stability, and Leigh felt increasingly disconnected with no community or support. The growing strain between her and Jack began to weigh heavily on her. In her heart, Leigh started to believe that if maybe they moved back to the Midwest, her home, things would improve. Life would be different, more manageable. So with their 3-month-old in tow, they moved across the country back to her home. Leigh was determined to turn things around. She enrolled in graduate school, taking on 21 credit hours to finish her degree in psychology, all while working full-time. Meanwhile, Jack prepared to start a new job. There was a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe this fresh start would bring the stability and support they'd been missing. But as the days passed, Leigh couldn't help but wonder, would this change really make things better? Would a new location, a new routine, finally bridge the growing gap between them? They were back in the Midwest with promising opportunities ahead, yet deep down, Leigh felt that the real challenge, their partnership, remained unresolved. So did things get better?
We get here. I took 21 hours so that I could finish in one semester. And he did some of the babysitting and lost another job. So he just would lose jobs because he would oversell himself that he had capacity to do things, and then for whatever reason in those settings he couldn't do them. So I'm pretty convinced that he struggles with some learning disabilities and didn't want to acknowledge them or recognize them, and really tried to cover with charisma, with joking with charm. But when rubber meets the road and you're in a position you can't do that position, you lose your job. So that was a regular situation.
How many times do you estimate that happened?
Well, he eventually just started his own company, so there was no accountability.
Okay.
But he lost probably at least half a dozen jobs in the first 5 years of our marriage. Mm-hmm. It was also really confusing because a lot of what I was seeing, I just thought was chaos and immaturity. So I kind of took this role of like, it felt very parentified. Like the big sister again, like trying to teach another human, this is what you should be doing. And he very much resented that, of course. But yeah, those first years were, I just thought, again, I'm going to overfunction. That wasn't my thought at the time, but it was just like, I'm going to work. I was in the hospital twice with heart palpitations, that type of driven person. That's like, I'm ignoring my body, but I'm going to get it done and I'm going to do it well. And it just kind of describes like who I was at that time.
Yeah. And you've used the term overfunctioning. And so what I want to just clarify is, overfunctioning is when we're being more than 100% responsible for everyone else in our lives. So it's like someone's underfunctioning. So then we step in to fill in that gap, which causes us to do more than we're supposed to do. And that can be a dance that a lot of relationships have. One's overfunctioning because one is underfunctioning, and eventually it starts to break down.
Right. And if you have a partner that doesn't have the ability to have empathy or to see your position, it looks like, well, what's wrong with this picture? Because it's working for them very well.
Yeah.
I wasn't listening to my body. Those were first signs that, I was still in my 20s and I was at the ER with heart issues.
Yeah.
Because I was so stressed out and just wanting to hurry and get that done so that I could get on to making a living for some stability so that my daughter would be okay.
Feeling the weight of needing to be the reliable provider, Leigh took a job at a local megachurch in a counseling role. Soon after, she became pregnant with her second child. While things seemed to be moving forward on the outside, life at home continued to unravel. Her relationship with Jack was strained, but Leigh felt unable to confide in anyone at work. The church had a clear message for its staff. If you're dealing with issues at home, you need to step away from your job to focus on your family. But for Leigh, walking away wasn't an option. She was the only one standing between her family and financial collapse. With a daughter to care for and another on the way, quitting wasn't realistic. So she stayed quiet, feeling the burden of the secret. Keeping her struggles hidden seemed like the safest choice, the only choice. Every day she went to work, helping others navigate their challenges, while quietly battling her own, knowing that revealing her truth could cost her the stability that her family depended on. This is really common for women in these situations. We almost have to be in a state of denial about the truth of our situation to begin to go into the outside world and be okay. But eventually what was happening at home grew more and more intense to where the denial was growing increasingly hard. And Leigh began to wonder, I don't know if this is going to get any better.
But I recall when I was pregnant with my son, very pregnant, in my daughter's room after Jack had come up and yelled in my face as a 9-month pregnant woman, and just being so confused and so sad that on the inside of this image was this life, and that what we projected on the outside was what I wanted so badly, and just the juxtaposition of what is real and what is perceived being so very different.
Yeah, I also just want to emphasize that, like, I can imagine, and maybe you could speak to this, that like the Leigh that everyone was seeing at work was very strong, a leader, very competent. You're a counselor, so you're providing space for other people's issues and helping them through that. And then at home, things are not going well. Things do not feel okay. There's confusion about what exactly you're dealing with. Is it learning disabilities? Is it mental health issues? Is it emotional immaturity? What's going on? So you just kind of kick in your coping mechanisms, which is, I'm going to keep life going to take pressure off of this person that's under functioning. And the more that I do that, then maybe they'll start having space to then kick in and start fulfilling their adult role. The opposite usually happens. Things get worse, and we're going to get into that into this episode. But I just want to highlight, because one of the purposes of this podcast is to feature true abuse survivors, because we are talking about abuse. You know, these people that have these stories, our first one, are significantly successful people in life. These are not down and outs, battered woman syndrome type people, which is the stereotype. These are our people helpers, our counselors, our leaders, our community ralliers. And oftentimes people don't know what they're going home to, partly because we don't always give people a peek into that, and we don't understand what it is. But for those of you that knew you in this phase of your life, they probably thought things were going fine.
Around that same time, you know, when we would fight, he would disappear, and on one occasion came home drunk and fell and cut his eye. And we went to counseling the following day, but only one time. Like, he would never follow through on like really working on anything. Gambling was happening too, but I could never really find out exactly what was happening. But we would have a surge of money, then no money. And he worked in an industry where he could make some financial decisions and just sign my name. And I was really unaware. I could get upset with myself that I wasn't more involved in my financial life, but I really entrusted him with the messages I was hearing, which was he was the head of the household, and that was my role. And I really just wanted to be good at being a wife and just keep parenting.
While parenting was Leigh's top priority, she constantly felt like she was pushing uphill when it came to co-parenting with Jack. Their efforts to work together were riddled with frustration, and Leigh recalled 2 incidences that still haunt her. In one instance, Leigh had come home from work, letting Jack know she was on her way home. This was before cell phones, so communication was limited, and she was about to turn onto their street when she saw Jack pulling out of the street. Her heart sank, then rage took over. Jack had left their 2- and 4-year-old children asleep in their beds, completely unaware of how close she was to getting home. He had chosen to leave them alone to play basketball, clearly prioritizing his own leisure over their safety. His lack of judgment was glaring, and Leigh was furious at the thought of what could have happened. Another time, Leigh came home to a freezing cold house. The electricity had been turned off, and her and the kids found their pet fish frozen from the temperature drop. It wasn't the first time the power had been cut off, and each time the stress and instability mounted. She remembered other days when they couldn't even pay for groceries. It wasn't just the material hardships that weighed on Leigh. It was the emotional toll on her children. They witnessed the constant tension between their parents, the fighting, Jack slamming doors, the feeling of instability that hung over the household just like a storm cloud. The chaos and uncertainty became their normal, a developmental trauma that lingered. For Leigh, the most painful part wasn't just the immediate struggles, but the lasting impact on her children. The stress, the constant fear of what might happen next. It shaped their childhood, and those memories left scars she couldn't erase. Was drinking kind of like a regular thing for him?
Not in the house, but he would disappear and drink and come back. And he, had been raised with alcoholism in his family. And really what I saw in his behavior a lot was just that, what we call a dry alcoholic. So alcohol is not needed, but a lot of the behavior of an alcoholic was played out. A lot of secrecy, a lot of quick to anger, a lot of outbursts, tantrums, insistence on seeing things the way that he wanted me to see them, not questioning him, and also like trying to make light of things when they were happening. So if I did bring something up, I was told like I was making a mountain out of a molehill and I need to let it go and trust best intentions, that had been preached.
Or we're way past that point.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. We're past the best intentions.
Right. But sermons were used, they were brought back into any type of conversation about how I was feeling disappointed or
they were
angry.
Used by Jack
in a manipulative way.
Yeah.
As his stance or his argument. So instead of saying, I'm sorry I let you down, or I shouldn't have done that, or I apologize for my anger, it was just, love keeps no record of wrongs. Why are you bringing this up again? You're unforgiving. You have an unforgiving spirit. Things were always put back on me and how I was feeling. And it was super disorienting because I wrestle with that already about doing everything right. And my inner critic was just constantly fed by the things I was doing wrong and not encouraged to have a mind of my own or thoughts of my own they were never validated. Feelings were never validated.
Well, and he'd established so early on that his opinion was also God's opinion. And it sounds like that was just reiterated
again and again.
Indefinitely.
Yeah, for sure.
So you're describing drinking, you're describing gambling, you're describing neglect because he would leave and go do whatever some things, but you don't know all the things. He was raging, he was angry, he was getting in your face, all of these things. So how much of that did the public see?
0 to none.
Okay.
Yeah, 0 to none. Maybe our neighbors that we weren't in relationship with might have heard it.
So what did the public see?
Oh, well, they saw a really gregarious, fun-loving, happy individual that, was always joking and happy, and they would see a wife that was working really hard to project an image of a healthy family, a generous family. We adopted 3 orphans. Like, we were viewed as like a really good family that gives back and that loves hard. And that was it. But we didn't, and we even had people in our home, like we hosted the family Bible studies. People came into our home and I would work super hard. So that was a beautiful setting when they came in. We went to church every single Sunday, whether we argued in the car on the way there, whether he was cussing at people in the parking lot on the way out, but we were there shining and smiling for that hour and a half. Some of that's on me. Like, I wanted to believe this narrative, this family that I was trying to project. I wanted to believe it so badly that I didn't have even any close friends that I told the truth to.
Yeah. I also just want to say, like, when you're in the Christian world and you're in the lifestyle that you're describing, you have to believe that because the only option is to have hope, to believe that Jesus can change things, that he can redeem things, restore things. And if you think anything outside of that narrative, you're sinful, you're not believing, you don't have faith. So it's like all of those beliefs come into this dynamic and hook you into, we just have to wait and watch what the Lord's going to do. Okay.
That's right.
And what I want to say is, absolutely, like there are times where those messages are helpful, but what you're describing to me is a partner that was unwilling to get help, unwilling to make changes, and was neglecting his role as a husband, as a dad. And when you have someone that's unwilling, you have a scenario that starts to break down.
Absolutely.
So I want to advocate for you as you're owning your part, which we appreciate you doing, but also acknowledge it's a very difficult scenario to rise up and to start to think, maybe this isn't working. Maybe this isn't what the Lord wants for me. Maybe this isn't good for me.
Right. I felt like this is a refining. I need to work harder on being less selfish, less demanding, more loving, more forgiving, more caring, more empathetic. Always. It was like Somebody described it to me one time when she was talking about divorce, about she and her husband being like two pieces of construction paper that had been glued together. And for me, it was like those two pieces were Jack and Jesus, right? And I couldn't pull the two apart because my becoming to faith and coming into this marriage and the community, and it all happened at the same time for me. And so it was a very enmeshed viewpoint of, even if I don't like you, I made a commitment to God, and I'm not seeing a reason that I would be able to leave.
After working at the megachurch for some time, Leigh found herself consumed by a deep passion to continue serving. It wasn't just about the job anymore. It became her way of coping with the emptiness she felt in her marriage. The connection with Jack had long faded, and rather than confront the growing void at home, Leigh threw herself into work. The more disconnected she felt, the more people she wanted to help. Leigh also felt a calling to expand her family. Adopting more children seemed like a way to fill the emotional gaps in her life. So that's what Leigh did. She and Jack adopted 3 children, expanding their family in a way that felt deeply meaningful. At the same time, Leigh started a passion business, a ministry that combined her expertise, her heart for helping others, and her longing to make an impact. It felt like the ultimate expression of who she was, a way to create the significance she had been yearning for. But 2 years in, her world came crashing down. One evening while going through the ministry's financial records, she made a shocking discovery. Jack had been stealing money, $18,000 worth. It felt like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a ministry. It was her passion, her dream, the place where she poured her heart and soul, and Jack had betrayed it all. Did his deviousness truly know no boundaries? The trust was shattered. It wasn't just the money. It was the realization that Jack didn't care about the damage he had done, and he quickly dismissed any responsibility.
He took money from my ministry without the board's approval. He quote unquote borrowed it, and he had put some back, but when I discovered it, I brought it before the board because you can't do that with a nonprofit especially, right? But he would say, I talked to you about it. We had a conversation, but he would make me feel so insanely crazy because I knew that I never would have agreed to something like that, nor did I ever. But he would twist and make up his own narrative and then expect me to go along with it. And he would wear me down on so many different fronts in that way that I would just start, I still question my sanity sometimes. Like, did that happen? And I don't remember that happening. I don't recall like giving you my 401k and saying cash it out. That's your signature. Like it was hard to like find evidence to support the truth in the face of somebody telling you, let's go with this story, and to the point that he would lie so much that he would believe it. Yeah. You could see that he believed it, and it looked real because he wanted that to be. When it did go before the board, the portion that was still remaining, because he could be so likable, was forgiven. So there was rarely a consequence. There was no accountability. Like even the people that should have been like, you could be arrested for this. There were some consequences. You can't have access and you're off the board, but it wasn't what it should have been or what it could have been because they loved me and they loved him. So I'm grateful for the grace, but it made it worse. When he got away with things, the cost became greater later.
Yeah, it didn't benefit you in the end.
Not in the end.
Definitely not him.
It fed the monster. So we now have 5 children, and the crash comes, right? The market crashes hard. He was managing things, so we had a rental property in our home, and we were living in another home. So we rented out our house, we were living in another house, and we had our first home, our little house. We lost them all of them. And we're basically I felt like I'm on a ship and my partner on this ship is blowing holes in my boat and there's wreckage all around me and I need to get to shore. We got to do something. And so I thought maybe if we moved back west where he had family and support, that he could rally. He could pull himself together and hold a job, I thought nothing's working here, clearly. There's nothing to build upon, and I was really devastated because in all of that I lost my ministry. So we decided to move across country, sell and give away almost everything we have to go back, because it's quite expensive to move all the way across the country again. And we get there, and he had a job promised to him, and within a few weeks, he quits. So he says, he comes home, he quit. Without talking to me, without telling me what went wrong. So now we're in so much financial stress, and I'm trying to work, literally was working 4 jobs, 4 part-time, as a counselor, as a professor, as a social worker, like working all these different roles, trying to keep us afloat. And there's one day I'm at home alone, and there's a knock on the door, and I go to the door and I open it, and it's a friend of ours that had been in our wedding that grew up with Jack. And I said, wow, it's so great. Well, hi. Like, I didn't even know that you knew we were back, and it's great to see you. And he was very angry and said, you owe me $18,000. And I said, what? What are you talking about? So that was the way I discovered that Jack had been borrowing money from friends without my knowledge. So that's when I realized that we were so far in debt and in a bigger hole than I could have ever imagined.